So yeah, thank you very much. My name's Jen Williams. I'm from Secarma. We're a cybersecurity consultancy based about 10 minutes from here. So we're your local friendly security advisors. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about how to find the weakest link in your organization. And the reason I've chosen this topic today, it might seem like quite an obvious one, but I think the world of security in which we're trying to work in is becoming more and more difficult every day. We've got attack techniques that are developing faster than we can keep up with. We've got security solutions that actually are always that one step behind and not able to keep pace. We've got securities becoming a widening field now, so we have to have different areas of expertise that maybe, 5 years ago even, we didn't think would become part of our roles. Costs are going up massively, so if you're responsible for hiring security skills, you'll know that the salaries are skyrocketing, again, at a pace that maybe businesses can't quite keep up with. There's an acceptance that actually now we're going to be compromised. That's a really difficult field to operate in. Imagine another role where you think, actually, no, we are definitely going to fail. There's no other job that exists like that other than in security. We are definitely going to be compromised at some point. And we're also then in this world where the government's starting to dip their finger in and legislate that we have to do certain things. So if you work in the field of producing IoT devices for consumers to use, now there's actually government legislation that dictates that those devices have to have some security. And that makes our jobs really difficult. So, you'll find that your security teams are now quite stressed and overworked. Last year, I did a presentation on this stage about how we shouldn't be buying too many tools because, we're really stressing out our security analysts. It's really difficult to form a good strategy today because, we don't know how quickly things like AI are going to change our roles. I'm also seeing a lot of clients now who are starting to get security budgets in a way they haven't before because, that conversation with the board is becoming slightly easier because of the media. But actually, those budgets are quite tough to allocate to the right areas. So we end up creating this huge web of activity, and actually, we can't quite measure the outcome. Are we being effective? So that for me is the scene of how we're working today. So I want to give a message that, we just need to do one thing. I think my clicker's stuck as well. Unless I've broken it. Thank you. So today's solution actually is just find the weakest link in your organization. And that's going to be different for each business. And in order to do that, you've got to understand what the normal fingerprint is of your organization. Okay, I think I'm relying on the backstage wizards to advance my slides for me now, so I'll just wave. Okay, raise your hand if you think risk assessments are boring. Thank you. I mean, I have to say, I expected a lot more than that. So anybody who's got their hand up, you're wrong. Risk assessments. Okay, granted, nobody woke up as a kid and thought, I really want to conduct risk assessments, that's my calling. But actually, that's the only way we're going to make our lives a bit easier now in this field that we've chosen to be in. And actually, why are they boring? Because they're what's going to illuminate our way. So risk assessments, for me, the reason we have to do them is to identify vulnerabilities within our organization. And actually, we need to do that before we've done any kind of technical verification or validation, because that bit gets expensive. We can do risk assessments within our business. We can then prioritize which areas of the business need our attention, and actually, it's not always the obvious ones. So as techies, we tend to think, right, let's lock down our server infrastructure, or let's make sure that our apps are all developed really securely. But what Secarma are seeing when we're doing consultancy with clients at the minute is there are these unknown, unconsidered areas that actually are starting to form the biggest risk to the organization. We're getting quite good at testing our apps, and we're getting quite good at making sure that we've got controls applied to our laptops. But what we're not good at is looking at those areas around the fringe that maybe haven't previously been part of our role. Risk assessments are needed for us to drown out the noise. How many kind of alerts do you get every day? How many, there's a possible issue with this application do we get all the time? Actually, most of the time, they might not be relevant to you. So those risk assessments really allow the business to focus on what's crucial. It's also part of pretty much every well-known information security standard. I know the NIST standard was mentioned in the previous presentation, as was ISO 27001. Risk assessments form the cornerstone of those standards with good reason. And they're also a really good tool for involving others in the business into information security. They're a great collaboration technique. How often have you thought, oh, if I could just get, my engineers to think more about security? Actually, doing risk assessments is a really good way of bringing people together and making security an inclusive topic. So here's my view of how risk assessment should work. Other risk assessment processes are available, but this is the one that I would subscribe to. So the first stage, and this is the bit that people often forget, is to actually identify what you've got. If you don't have a good handle on not just physical assets, so I'm not just talking about laptops, servers, mobile phones, but also your information assets. So information asset is anything that adds value to your business. So that might be things like knowledge that's kept securely locked in your security engineer's brain. Or it could be, a filing cabinet somewhere that has all of your contracts in it. We're not necessarily talking about physical, technological assets. We're talking about anything that adds value to your business. So don't miss that part out. If you do, you've got an incomplete risk assessment, and you may as well have not done one. Choose a framework. So risk assessments, they can be complicated, they can be messy, and they need to be repeatable. So choose either a framework that's already established, and there are frameworks within things like ISO 27001. There are other kind of standalone risk assessment frameworks that you can use, or actually come up with one that suits your business. There's no requirement to have a specific framework, just have one so that anybody involved in the process can make it repeatable. You then go through a situation where you consider all of those different risk scenarios, and my next slide will go into some of those activities that will help to draw out those risk scenarios. You then need to consider the likelihood and the impact of that happening, because actually that's what's going to allow you to drill down into where your biggest risk is and where your weakest link is. You're then going to rank those according to score, and then you'll choose to mitigate those highest risks. And actually, that's the bit that's commonly executed quite poorly, because I can't remember if I put it on the slide. I might have done, I might have to repeat this in a second, but I see so many examples of organizations that buy tools and then retrospectively fit their risk assessment to that tool. And I can see people laughing, but also people nodding. That happens so commonly because we don't go through this process. And actually, did we need a tool at all? Have we already got something that could have done that? So these are some of the methods that you might use to identify risks in the organization. And actually, using a variety of these techniques allows for full coverage, where actually, if you're just doing a tabletop kind of discussion, you might miss bits. If you're just relying on technical activities, you're going to miss bits. So things like having a really good internal audit program. Your auditors don't need to be technical specialists. They just need to be people who are detailed and who can ask the right questions. You can also have things like pen tests, so actual technical activities, pen tests, vulnerability scans. They can help pull out risks from within your technical estate. Don't underestimate the value of threat modeling. So I know threat modeling is discussed when we're doing software development, and I'm a huge fan of threat modeling, but actually it can be used for non-technical activities. You can threat model a HR process before you've implemented it, for example. Things like employee surveys, so figure out what your employees know, how are they likely to behave. These can all form part of your risk assessment. You then need some context to those, so make sure that you're using things like threat intelligence feeds to figure out actually, there might be a threat that's in the media, but is it relevant to your organization? And you can do that through the risk assessments. I'll have to explain this one. I thought this was funny when I wrote it, but it's probably not now. So who's best to conduct a risk assessment? Probably not you as a security leader, and probably not you as an IT team who's built the infrastructure. And that's because nobody says their own baby's ugly. Mine was, but I'm not allowed to say that. So make sure that you have a suitable level of independence, that you're not almost marking your own homework. If you've built an application as a software developer, you feel very passionate about that, and you're actually unlikely to be able to detect those kind of risks without having an outsider's view. And we see that quite a lot. So Secarma do hundreds and hundreds of pen tests for applications every year. And we regularly get phone calls from development teams saying, well, you've identified this vulnerability, but it's not actually a vulnerability because, it gets used like this and not like this. And I understand this is a really emotional thing when somebody said, this thing you've spent your last 6 months building has a vulnerability, and it's really difficult to take. So make sure that those people are kind of removed enough to have an objective view. Just some examples then of some commonly overlooked high-risk areas that are starting to show themselves. So IoT devices, I mentioned earlier that, if you're now manufacturing IoT devices for consumers, they have to meet this legislation. No such legislation exists for businesses buying IoT devices. So, we're kind of on our own a bit to make sure that they meet the minimum security standards. Employee or contractor travel, that's a huge area of risk, and I'll tell you a story about why I focus in on this. I was maybe about 6 years ago traveling down to InfoSec in London, and I was sat on a train opposite two guys who worked for a company that was named during this conversation. They were discussing their antics on the golf course and how this person had said this, and oh yeah, my wife does this. This other person works at this site. And it got to the point by about 10 minutes into this conversation, I'd figured out the guy's wife's birthday, where they worked, their patterns of work, the office site, who was likely to be going in when. And at one point, I think they must have noticed me looking at them, and they said, oh, what have you been up to? I said, I've been to a security conference. I work in information security. I'm like, oh, you must get to see loads of really exciting stuff. And I said, well, actually, the biggest vulnerabilities I see are people talking on trains. And the guys went, oh, yeah, I bet, and then carried on. Malicious insiders, nobody wants to think that their organization has malicious insiders, but it's such a common, and okay, maybe they're not even malicious, maybe they're just careless. But insider threat is still a really prevalent area of risk you should look at. And the other one for me is having a lack of a plan. I open this with saying, there's an inevitability that we're going to get attacked now. So not having a really robust and well-tested response plan is a real high-risk area. So if you only do one thing this year, if you are an SME, and okay, this might be quite generalized because I've worked in some SMEs who've got fabulously high mature security, nothing to do with the fact that I was employed there at all. Or maybe you're just starting out on your security journey, look at something really basic like Cyber Essentials. That's probably going to kill off a lot of your high-risk areas. If you're in an organization that's maybe slightly more developed, and you've got some maturity, look at your supply chain. And actually, if you're in a very mature organization, you've got security teams and tools and monitoring and all that kind of stuff, have a look at an assumed breach simulation. So let somebody actually compromise your system and make sure that your response plans are going to work. If you're not sure of your maturity level, figure it out. Choose a framework, conduct an audit, compare yourself against industry peers, or get external help with benchmarking. Secarma do that. If you're still not sure where to start, There's a big purple banner outside with some really smiley, happy people. You can't miss us. Come and speak to one of our consultants. We don't staff our stand with salespeople. We've got people ready to answer your legit questions on where to get started. There you go. I told you I'd be on time.